At the birthday table, my grandson said, "You're not blowing the candles." The words came out so casually, like a pebble tossed into a still pond, yet they sent ripples through the room that only I seemed to feel. He didn't shout, he didn't laugh, just a simple statement, delivered with the bluntness only children can afford. The adults at the table chuckled lightly, as though it were all in good humor, but the sound felt sharp against my skin. My daughter busied herself with arranging plates, my son-in-law poured drinks into tall glasses, and the other grandchildren clapped their hands in rhythm, waiting for the cake to be sliced. No one turned their head toward me to correct the child, no one leaned down to whisper that perhaps he'd misspoken. I sat there, straight-backed in a chair pulled slightly away from the table, watching the candles flicker and drip tiny beads of wax into the frosting. It was my birthday, not his. My name had been written on the cake in shaky blue icing, though I noticed someone had spelled it shorter, Nana instead of my full name, as though trimming down my identity into something smaller, easier to manage. I looked at the 7 candles they'd stuck into the middle. 7, not 72. As if shaving off the years would make me less of a burden, less of a reminder of time. My grandson's voice still hung in the air. "You're not blowing the candles." I leaned forward anyway, slow enough that the movement felt deliberate, intentional. My breath gathered in my chest, but before it could escape, my daughter placed her hand firmly on my arm. "Oh, Mom, let him do it." "He's been practicing all week," she said brightly, her eyes fixed on her son as though I were invisible. I froze, my lips still parted, the warmth of my own breath caught like a secret inside my throat. The little boy puffed out his cheeks and blew hard, extinguishing all 7 flames in one go. The family erupted in applause, clapping and cheering as though it had been his triumph, his moment. I smiled, or at least I arranged my face into something that resembled a smile. No one seemed to notice that it didn't quite reach my eyes. A knife cut through the cake, passing slices around the table. Someone placed a piece in front of me, a neat square corner with a flower of icing, but by then the sweetness had turned bitter in my mouth. As the evening carried on with chatter and laughter, I felt myself shrink further into my chair. Each voice rose and fell around me like waves, but I was no longer part of their tide. I had been set on the shore, a spectator rather than a participant. I excused myself after the cake, claiming tiredness, and slipped into the quiet hallway. The mirror above the console caught my reflection as I passed, and for a moment I paused to look at myself. My hair, white and fine, curled softly at the temples. My blouse, carefully pressed earlier that morning, now felt too formal for the occasion. My shoulders were squared, but my eyes betrayed me, they carried that hollow echo I remembered from years ago, when I'd been overlooked in other ways. It wasn't the first time. That's what stunned the most. I remembered my 40th birthday, when my husband had forgotten entirely. He'd been away on business, or at least that's what he said. The children were small then, and I'd baked my own cake because no one else thought to. I had leaned forward to blow the candles, alone in the kitchen, the smoke curling upward like a quiet prayer. Back then, I told myself it didn't matter. But now, decades later, hearing my own grandson declare that I wasn't allowed to claim even this small ritual, it felt like a thread snapping somewhere deep inside me. I went into the guest room, the one they always gave me when I stayed overnight. The sheets were crisp, the lamp low, and on the dresser sat a small ceramic dish where I'd left my earrings earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened faintly to the laughter continuing downstairs. They didn't miss me. Not yet. Maybe not at all. I thought about calling a friend, though my list of friends had grown shorter over the years. Some had passed, some had moved, some had simply drifted away with time. The ones who remained were kind, but I didn't want kindness. I wanted to feel present, visible, necessary. I wanted someone to tell me, "It's your birthday. You blow the candles." Instead, I sat in silence and allowed the memory of that single sentence to replay. Each time it did, I heard not just a child's voice but the echo of all the other times I'd been told, in one way or another, that I wasn't needed. When I retired, my colleagues threw a party but forgot to mention my years of late nights and sacrifices. When my husband passed, the casseroles arrived, but so did the subtle shifting away of couples who no longer knew how to fit me into their gatherings. When my daughter planned vacations with her family, she always said the same line, "It'll be too tiring for you, Mom." Maybe next time. Next time rarely came. That night, I lay awake long after the house quieted. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint glow of moonlight that slipped between the blinds. My grandson's words echoed again and again, not out of malice, but out of truth. In his small world, I had no place at the table of celebration. I had become the audience, not the guest of honor. By morning, I decided something quietly. I would not allow myself to disappear. Not yet. Not like this. So when I came down to breakfast, I wore my red scarf. It was one of the few bold pieces I owned, a gift I'd bought for myself years ago when I'd first started traveling alone. My daughter raised her eyebrows slightly when she saw it, but said nothing. The children chattered about school, about cartoons, about anything but me. I stirred my tea and listened, but inside, I was already making plans. I didn't know exactly what those plans were, not yet. But I knew they would begin with something small, something mine. Perhaps a trip to the park alone, or a class at the community center, or even buying a new notebook and writing down the things I never said aloud. The thought gave me a quiet spark, almost like those candles before they'd been blown out. And that spark, I decided, was mine to guard. When I got home the morning after the birthday, the apartment smelled faintly of lavender from the sachet in my dresser drawer. The silence wrapped around me the way a heavy coat does when you've been out in the wind. For once, the silence didn't feel cruel. It felt like my own. I set my bag down by the chair, took off my shoes, and made tea in the chipped blue mug I've had for 30 years. The mug was older than my grandson, older than the hand that had pressed on my arm to stop me from blowing out my own candles. The first sip burned my tongue, but I let the pain sit there. It was sharp and real, unlike the dull ache that had been gathering in me for years. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea and stared at the blank pad of paper I usually reserved for shopping lists. A thought came, unexpected, insistent, write it down. Not for anyone else, not for posterity, not even to read again. Just to let it out of the tight space it occupied inside me. So I picked up a pen and wrote the sentence I couldn't stop hearing. My grandson told me I couldn't blow out my own candles. I looked at it on the page. Simple black ink, unadorned. But it was the truth, written down where it couldn't be denied. I wrote the next line too, and nobody corrected him. The words looked small, but they carried the weight of the evening. I kept going. I wrote about the 7 candles instead of 72, about the way my daughter smiled at her son and not at me, about the icing spelling a name that wasn't mine. Each line stripped away a little more of the numbness. Each sentence felt like a breath I had been holding for years. When the page was full, I folded it once and slid it into the notebook I used to keep recipes in. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because recipes are about ingredients and instructions, and what I'd written was its own kind of recipe for hurt. I poured another cup of tea and sat back. For a long time, I just listened to the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. 72 years, reduced to background noise in my own family's house. I had lived through long winters, a husband's death, children leaving, and the endless small erasures that come with age, yet somehow it was a child's sentence that cut deepest. But it also woke something. A stubbornness I hadn't felt since my 40s, when I first learned to drive long after my peers said I was too old, or when I booked a trip to the seaside alone just to prove to myself I could. That same spark flickered now. I wasn't ready to fold myself up like an old quilt and let them tuck me away. I opened the closet and pulled out the red scarf I'd worn the night before. The color still looked bold, alive, defiant. I tied it around my neck and looked in the mirror. My reflection startled me, not young, no, but not gone either. There was steel in my eyes, the kind you get from standing up after being knocked down too many times. I decided to leave the house. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to be out in the world, not folded into the quiet corners of my apartment. The air outside was cold and sharp. I walked to the bus stop with my scarf pulled close and my bag light at my side. The bus came with a sigh of brakes, and I climbed aboard. I got off near the community center. I'd passed the building 100 times but never stepped inside. It always looked too busy, too full of other people's lives. But today I opened the door. Inside, the air was warm, buzzing with voices. A bulletin board was covered with bright flyers, painting classes, yoga, language groups, a choir. My eyes landed on the word choir and lingered. I hadn't sung in years, not since church when the children were little. My voice used to rise above the others, thin but clear, like a thread weaving through cloth. The memory made me smile, and then it made me ache. I reached for the flyer, tore off a strip with the contact number, and slipped it into my pocket. That small act, just a tear of paper, felt like lighting a match inside me. On the way home, I stopped at the bakery. The bell over the door chimed, and the warm scent of bread and sugar wrapped around me. I bought a lemon tart for myself and, almost on impulse, a single cupcake. And one candle, I told the woman behind the counter. She raised an eyebrow but didn't comment, just wrapped it neatly. Back in my apartment, I set the cupcake on a plate and pressed the candle into the frosting. I struck a match and lit it. The tiny flame wavered, casting a glow that made the room feel less empty. I leaned forward and blew it out. The smoke curled upward, soft and steady. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was reclaiming something small but sacred. Later, I took out the strip of paper with the choir's number and dialed it. My hands trembled as the line rang, but when a cheerful woman answered, I cleared my throat and asked about joining. She told me rehearsals were Thursday evenings, no auditions, just voices gathering. "Bring yourself," she said. "That's enough." When I hung up, my heart was beating faster than it should have, as though I'd just climbed a hill. But it was the good kind of beating, the kind that reminded me I was alive, still capable of reaching for something new. That night, as I sat at the table writing in my notebook again, I thought about the birthday. The hurt was still there, but it no longer sat like a stone on my chest. It was something I could name, write down, even place beside a small cupcake with a candle of my own choosing. For years I had been shrinking quietly, thinking it was graceful. But I realized now it was not grace, it was erasure. And I was tired of disappearing. So I wrote one last sentence before closing the book: "This year, I will not wait for permission to blow out my candles." The following Thursday I found myself standing outside the community center just after 6, my breath making small clouds in the evening air. The windows glowed with light from within, voices carrying out like a tide reaching the street. For a moment, I almost turned back. My hand hovered near my scarf, fingers curling the way they always do when I'm trying to convince myself to be braver than I feel. But then I remembered the cupcake with its single candle. I remembered the way the smoke had curled upward after I blew it out, how steady it looked, how it had felt like proof that I could still claim something small for myself. I tightened my scarf and stepped inside. The choir room was bigger than I expected. Folding chairs were arranged in wide semicircles, and people were already filling them, men and women with silver hair, middle-aged faces, even a few younger ones. Some were laughing with each other, others arranging sheet music on their laps. A woman with short cropped hair and a wide smile greeted me at the door. "You must be new," she said warmly. I nodded. "Yes. First time." "Well, you're in the right place," she said, ushering me inside. "I'm Marion. Don't worry about auditions or anything like that. We're here to enjoy ourselves. Sit wherever you like." Her kindness was simple, unforced. It soothed the tightness in my chest. I chose a seat near the back, close enough to feel part of the group but not so close that anyone would notice if my voice trembled. When we began, the sound startled me. So many voices at once, rising and weaving, filling every corner of the room. At first I mouthed the words more than I sang them, uncertain of how my voice would fit. But then the woman beside me, a stranger with kind eyes, leaned over and whispered, "Just sing. That's what we're all here for." So I opened my mouth and let the sound come. Thin at first, tentative, but then stronger as it found the notes it had once known. The harmonies wrapped around me, carrying me along. For the first time in years, I wasn't just listening, I was part of the music itself. When the rehearsal ended, people gathered in little clusters, chatting as they packed up their things. I stood apart, clutching my coat, ready to slip away quietly. But Marion caught me at the door. "You've got a lovely voice," she said. I laughed lightly. "It's rusty." "Rust adds character," she replied. "See you next week?" And just like that, I knew I would come back. Walking home, my steps felt lighter, though the night was cold. I realized I hadn't thought about the birthday table once during the rehearsal. Not once. The sting was still there, but it had loosened its grip, replaced for an hour by something brighter. The next morning, I wrote about it in my notebook. I sang again. My voice was softer than it used to be, but it was mine. And nobody told me to stop. A few days later, my daughter called. She was in her usual rush, her voice clipped between errands. "We're going up to the lake this weekend," she said. "It's going to be a lot of work with the kids, so maybe it's best if you stay home and rest." There it was again, that familiar exclusion wrapped in polite reasoning. I felt the old ache stir, but this time I didn't swallow it whole. "I won't be home anyway," I told her. A pause. "Oh. Where will you be?" "At choir rehearsal," I said calmly. The silence on the line stretched just long enough for me to notice it. Then she laughed lightly. "Choir? That's nice, Mom. Very social." Her tone made it sound like a novelty, a hobby to keep me busy while the real world spun elsewhere. I almost bristled, but then I let it pass. She didn't need to understand. It wasn't for her. That weekend, I didn't think about the lake or the family photos they'd take without me. I thought about music, about the way voices lifted when they found the same note, about how something simple could knit strangers into companions. The following Thursday, I returned. This time, I sang without holding back. My voice cracked once, but I didn't stop. Marion clapped when we finished, and the group cheered themselves. No one cared about cracks or age, they cared about the sound, the joy. When rehearsal ended, a few people invited me to join them at the cafe across the street. I hesitated, then said yes. We sat over coffee and pastries, talking about small things, the weather, the music, which bus line ran the latest. But even in those small things, I felt included. Nobody looked past me. Nobody dismissed me. On the way home, I realized how long it had been since I'd been part of a conversation where my words felt welcome. At family gatherings, my voice often drifted unheard under the louder chatter of my children and their spouses. Here, even a comment about the bus was listened to, replied to. At home, I placed the cafe napkin with a scribbled phone number on my counter. Someone had said, "Call if you want to walk to rehearsal together." I stared at the napkin, realizing it had been years since someone had given me their number without obligation, just out of friendship. That night, before bed, I lit the beeswax candle I'd bought with the cupcake. I set it in a dish and watched the flame. I thought of the birthday table, of my grandson's words, and I thought of the choir. The difference was stark. One had silenced me, the other had given me my voice back. Still, when I spoke to my daughter again, she asked the same questions in her brisk, managerial way. "How are you keeping busy, Mom?" she said, as though I were a retired employee whose job was to fill hours. "I'm not busy," I replied evenly. "I'm singing." She didn't respond right away. Perhaps she didn't know what to say. Perhaps she thought it was silly, an indulgence. But it didn't matter. For the first time in a long while, her opinion didn't define the weight of my days. Instead, I thought of the next rehearsal, of the pages of my notebook filling with sentences that belonged to me, of the scarf that still felt bold around my neck. For years, I had let myself shrink into the edges of other people's lives. But now, with each note sung and each line written, I was beginning to take up space again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a flame that refused to go out no matter how many times someone else leaned forward to blow it away. By the third week at choir, I noticed something surprising. My body remembered how to stand. Not the careful posture of someone making herself smaller, but the way I used to hold myself when I was younger, when my lungs filled fully and my back carried no apology. I stood in the second row now, no longer hiding in the back. When the notes rose, I let mine rise too. They weren't perfect, but they belonged. After rehearsal, Marian pressed a sheet of music into my hand. "We're performing at the spring fair," she said. "You'll be ready." The word performing startled me. For years I had performed invisibility at family dinners, performed gratitude for small crumbs of attention. But here, the performance was different. It meant being seen. At home that night, I tucked the music into my notebook. My handwriting had grown steadier, the pages thicker with entries. I no longer just recorded hurt, I recorded action. Sang alto line tonight without faltering. Had coffee with Margaret after rehearsal. Bought myself new shoes, comfortable and red. The notebook was becoming proof that I was still moving forward, line by line. Still, old habits die slowly. When my daughter invited me over for Sunday lunch, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, to protect the fragile spark I was building. But another part whispered that avoiding them wasn't the answer. So I went. The table was crowded, as always, full of the noise of children and clattering cutlery. My grandson was playing with a toy car, oblivious to me. My daughter sat down a roast, her movements brisk and practiced. At some point, she asked, "So, Mom, how's the little singing group?" She said it with that tone again, diminishing, as though it were a pastime for someone passing time. I felt the old heat rise in my chest. I almost laughed bitterly, but instead I set my fork down and answered carefully. "It's not little," I said. "It's a choir. And we'll be performing in the spring fair." The table went quiet for a moment. My son-in-law looked up from carving meat, eyebrows raised. My daughter blinked, perhaps surprised by my firmness. "Well, that's nice," she said after a pause, returning to the roast. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted. They had heard me, maybe not understood, maybe not valued, but heard. And that mattered. Later, when the children sang happy birthday belatedly for one of their cousins, I excused myself for a moment and went to the kitchen. I looked at the stack of plates, the half-empty juice cartons, the mess of cake crumbs. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply apart. And that apartness felt less like exile and more like choice. On the bus ride home, I thought of how many years I'd sat at that table quietly, swallowing words. Now, with one calm sentence, I'd claimed my own place. That week at rehearsal, Marian asked me to lead the altos for a short passage. I almost refused, but then I thought of my daughter's raised eyebrow and decided otherwise. My voice wavered at first, but when the others followed my cue, something loosened. I realized that leadership didn't need to roar. It could be a steady note, carried long enough for others to trust. After rehearsal, Margaret invited me to her house for tea. Her home was small, cluttered with books and photographs. We sat at her table, sipping from mismatched mugs. She asked about my family, and I found myself telling her the story of the birthday candles. She didn't laugh or minimize. She just listened, nodding, her hand resting lightly on mine when I faltered. "That must have hurt," she said softly. The simplicity of her acknowledgement brought tears to my eyes. No one in my family had said it. They had brushed it off, moved past it, called me tired or sensitive. But here was someone saying plainly what it was. Hurt. I left her house lighter, as though naming it had drained some of the poison. The next morning, I wrote in my notebook, "It's not about the candles. It's about being allowed to breathe in my own house." Weeks passed. The choir became a rhythm, the notebook a ritual, the scarf a banner I wore even on ordinary days. Each step made me braver. So when my daughter called one afternoon, asking if I could watch the children while she ran errands, I hesitated. Once, I would have said yes automatically, reshaping my day around her needs. But now I looked at my calendar, at the circled date for choir practice. I can't tonight, I told her. I have rehearsal. A pause again. It's just singing, Mom. No, I said firmly. It's not just singing. It's important to me. Silence, then a sigh. All right. I'll figure it out. When I hung up, my hands were trembling. But it wasn't fear, it was exhilaration. I had chosen myself. That evening, I walked into choir with my head higher. Nobody there knew the small victory I'd won, but I did. And as I sang, my voice felt fuller, anchored by that choice. On the way home, I passed the bakery and bought another cupcake. This time, no candle. I didn't need the symbol anymore. The act of buying it, eating it slowly at my own table, was enough. Still, the echoes of the birthday hadn't disappeared. At night, when the house was quiet, I sometimes heard my grandson's voice again, "You're not blowing the candles." But now, instead of shrinking from it, I answered silently, "I already have." By early spring, the choir rehearsals no longer felt like borrowed time. They felt like mine. The calendar on my wall was dotted with circles around Thursdays, the ink darkening with each week I kept the promise to myself. I noticed my voice growing steadier, less tentative, as if it too had been waiting all these years for permission to be heard. One evening after rehearsal, Marion announced that our first public performance would be at the town square during the spring fair. I felt the ripple of excitement around me, but inside I felt something else, a weight and a lightness mixed together. To stand in front of strangers and sing would be daunting, yes, but in some ways it seemed easier than standing at my daughter's table and asking to blow out 7 candles. When I mentioned the performance to my daughter over the phone, she gave a polite "That's nice, Mom," the same tone she used when the children brought home scribbled drawings. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "We'll see if we can come." I told myself not to expect them. Better to be surprised than disappointed. But still, some small part of me longed for them to see me, not as the quiet grandmother in the corner, not as the one too fragile to join the trips, but as someone standing tall, singing under the open sky. The weeks leading up to the fair passed quickly. At each rehearsal, I found myself less afraid to take a breath, less afraid to hold a note longer than comfort allowed. Margaret and I grew closer. We often walked home together, her stories of teaching years ago spilling into my own stories of raising children. She never once suggested I was too late to begin again. At home, I prepared for the performance in my own small ways. I bought a new blouse, not expensive, but chosen carefully, a deep blue that made my eyes look brighter. I practiced standing in front of the mirror, shoulders back, chin level. I even sang softly while washing dishes, letting the steam rise around me like applause. The morning of the fair dawned bright and cool. I pinned the choir's badge to my blouse, wrapped my red scarf around my shoulders, and walked to the square with Margaret. The crowd was already gathering, children with balloons, couples carrying paper cones of roasted nuts, the air buzzing with anticipation. When we assembled on the makeshift stage, my heart thudded so loudly I thought the others might hear it. But when the first note rose, something remarkable happened. The nerves melted. My voice joined the others, blending and lifting, carrying out into the open air. The sound wasn't just music, it was declaration. I was here. I had breath, I had presence, I had something to give. As we sang, I scanned the crowd. For a moment, I thought I saw my daughter near the back, the children restless at her side. But then the song carried me forward, and I lost sight of her. When the final chord rang out and the applause surged, I bowed with the others, my cheeks warm not with embarrassment but with pride. Afterward, Margaret squeezed my hand. "You were wonderful," she said. I laughed. We were. And then I saw them, my daughter, my son-in-law, my grandchildren, threading their way through the crowd. My grandson's eyes were wide. "Nana, you were singing," he exclaimed, as though he'd stumbled upon a secret. "Yes," I said simply. "I was." My daughter gave a small smile, awkward, almost hesitant. "That was nice, Mom. You sounded good." The words weren't extravagant, but they were enough. For once, she wasn't dismissing, she was acknowledging. I let that be what it was. We walked together toward the food stalls, the children tugging at sleeves for treats. My daughter asked if I wanted to join them for lunch. I almost said yes, out of habit. But then I thought of the long table, the noise, the familiar tug of being pushed aside. I wanted to end the morning with the music still echoing inside me, not drowned out. "Not today," I said gently. "I'm meeting Margaret for tea." Her eyebrows rose, but she didn't argue. "All right. Another time, then." It was such a small exchange, but inside me it felt like a mountain shifting. For once, I had not bent my day to fit theirs. I had chosen differently. That evening, when I lit the beeswax candle at my table, I thought of the birthday again. My grandson's words still echoed, "You're not blowing the candles." But this time, I heard them differently. He was only repeating what he'd absorbed, the unspoken truth of how I'd been treated for years. And yet, by standing on that stage, by choosing my own lunch, by writing in my notebook, I had already blown out far bigger candles than those 7. The smoke rose from the candle in a thin spiral. I watched it drift upward and fade. For the first time, the memory of that birthday didn't sting. It simply existed. A part of the story, but not the ending. And I realized something then: my life was no longer waiting for a table to invite me. I was building my own. My grandson's drawing made me laugh, not out of mockery but because it was so true in its strange way. A stick figure with a scarf, mouth open in a circle of song, it was me, as he saw me now. Not just a grandmother who hovered at the edge of the table, but a figure in motion, sound spilling out. I held the paper in my hands longer than necessary, smoothing its creases as if it were something fragile. "Thank you," I told him, my voice soft but steady. "It's beautiful." He grinned, pleased, and darted off to wrestle with his cousin, the card still warm in my hand. I pinned it to my chest for a moment, like a badge. My daughter noticed and smiled, a small, genuine smile, not the distracted kind she often wore when juggling plates and voices. The evening unfolded quietly. Dinner was simple but warm, conversation moving like a gentle tide. I didn't hover in the background this time. I served myself, poured my own drink, spoke when I had something to say, and let the silence settle comfortably when I didn't. Nobody told me to rest, nobody corrected me, nobody brushed me aside. Perhaps they sensed I would not allow it anymore. When the cake appeared, covered in sprinkles and slightly lopsided, I braced without meaning to. My daughter set it down and looked at me. "It's yours, Mom," she said firmly, almost as though she were correcting not me, but the echo of last year. "All yours." The room went still. 7 candles again, this time at my request, because 72 or 73 or however many it was didn't matter. 7 was enough to make a glow. My grandson leaned close, eager, but my daughter touched his shoulder gently. "Let Nana blow them this year." I drew in a long, deliberate breath. The faces around me blurred a little, the way they do when your eyes fill without spilling. And then I blew. The flames fluttered, bent, and disappeared into curls of smoke. Applause rose, but it wasn't the clapping that mattered. It was the silence in that brief moment before, the space where my breath alone filled the room. Later, as the children slept and the dishes clattered in the sink, I sat with my daughter on the porch. The air smelled faintly of lilacs from a neighbor's yard. She held her cup in both hands and stared into it before speaking. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said quietly. The words startled me. "For what?" I asked. "For last year," she said. For a lot of years, maybe. I didn't realize how much I was pushing you aside. I thought I was protecting you, or making things easier. But I see now. I see it wasn't right. Her voice trembled on the edges. My first instinct was to brush it off, to say it's fine, don't worry, I'm used to it. But I stopped myself. That phrase, I'm used to it, had been the blanket I'd pulled over too many wounds. This time, I let the wound breathe. It hurt, I said simply. More than you know. She nodded, eyes lowered. I know. I think about it now and I feel ashamed. I reached out, placing my hand over hers. Her skin was warm, familiar. Don't be ashamed, I told her. Just, don't forget. She squeezed my hand back. The silence stretched, but it wasn't heavy. It was a bridge, carrying us both forward. When I left that night, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something quieter, steadier, like a river that had finally found its path after years of being dammed. In the weeks that followed, life resumed its ordinary rhythms. The choir met, the bakery bell chimed, the rosemary grew taller on the sill. But within the ordinary, there was a subtle shift. My daughter's calls were softer now, less commanding. She asked what days worked for me, not if I was free. My grandson spoke of my singing as though it were a fact of my identity, like my white hair or my red scarf. Even my son-in-law, who rarely noticed such things, asked once how the choir was going, and listened long enough for me to answer. But the real change was inside me. I no longer measured my worth by their acknowledgement. The performance at the spring fair, the quiet tea with friends, the solitary cupcake with its single candle, all of these had taught me that visibility begins within. If you refuse to vanish in your own eyes, eventually others must adjust their gaze. I filled my notebook with sentences that surprised me. I am learning a new piece in Latin. I bought myself earrings, small silver ones, because I liked them. I told my daughter no without guilt. Each entry felt like a step on a staircase I hadn't realized I was climbing. One afternoon, Margaret and I sat in the park beneath the ginkgo tree. She read aloud from a book of poems she carried everywhere, her voice weaving through the leaves overhead. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "You've changed since I met you." I laughed softly. Maybe I've just gone back to who I was before I started disappearing. She tilted her head. Or maybe you've become someone new. I thought about that for a long while. Maybe both were true. As summer edged toward autumn, I found myself thinking less about the birthday table that had once wounded me. The memory was still there, but dulled, like an old scar that only aches when the weather shifts. What mattered more were the new memories I was weaving, the choir's laughter, the scent of rosemary, the way my grandson's drawing fluttered each time I opened the cupboard where I'd pinned it. On the last warm evening of the season, I lit the beeswax candle again. I watched the flame bend, steady itself, bend again. I thought of all the years I had let others blow out my candles for me, in one way or another. And I thought of how many I still had left to light, no matter the number. I didn't need applause. I didn't need grand gestures. All I needed was this, the quiet, stubborn act of breathing in and breathing out, of taking my place at the table, of singing when I had a song, of refusing to vanish. The candle guttered, flared, and went out. Smoke curled upward, tracing invisible paths in the air. I followed it with my eyes until it faded, and then I whispered to the empty room, not as a vow but as a truth. I am still here. And for the first time in many years, the words felt enough.